Hi, everyone. My name is Latrice Lyle, and I am here to present 4 key levers for an anti-racist classroom at the Upper Elementary Teachers Conference 2022. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we get into the content today, I want to give us some time to connect. This link will be available in your workbook, and at this link, you can find me on all your favorite social media platforms. You can find a link to my website, and you can join our email list right there, all in our link tree. So I'm going to make sure that this is in your workbook because I want you to follow me and get to know my work more, and I want to be able to follow you and learn how I can better support educators like you in creating anti-racist classrooms. So a bit more about me. I am the founder and chief equity and executive officer of Equity Consulting. I am a career educator, and I know this is the Upper Elementary Teacher Conference, and I want to let you all know that 4th grade is my jam. If 4th grade is your jam, make sure you comment on this video and let me know. Let me know your favorite thing to teach in 4th grade too. I went to undergrad at the University of Georgia, and then I completed 2 master's degrees, one in elementary education, specifically at Johns Hopkins Graduate School of Education. And then most recently, I completed a master's in school leadership at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Now I want to get to know you all a bit better. So with that, and I will move my recording window to the other side. I want you to visit our Padlet and share your name, grade level, and location. This is super helpful so that I can get to know my audience better, but also you all can connect and get to know each other. And just to give you a preview of what our Padlet looks like, it looks like this. Of course, when I'm recording this video, there's nothing here, but as we spend time together over the course of the conference, you'll be able to share in this first column a bit more about yourself. And I'll reference these additional columns as we go through our presentation today. All right. Also, quick peek at our workbook. So here's our workbook. You'll be able to make a copy of this workbook and use it and follow along. All right, so back to the action. I like to start each school year, as well as each time I'm leading learning with adults, with some agreements. The 4 agreements that I ask that we hold in this space today are: first, centering the young people that we serve, staying engaged, listening actively, and most importantly, I want you to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. When we are uncomfortable and we create a space that is psychologically safe, we get to be, and we push ourselves to be rather, in our learning zone, where when we're right on the cusp of being uncomfortable and we are on the cusp of, or in a space that is psychologically safe, just like our kids, we can and we do learn even more. So I'm going to ask that we push ourselves to stay in that space during this time. And then if at any time you need to take a break, you need to do anything to care for yourself, know that you can press pause, and I'll be here when you get back. Okay, so let's start with this quote. I know the quote is dense. You might want to pause it here and read it, but I'm going to voice over the portion that's bolded and in yellow writing. But unless they are walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, unless they are actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carried along with the others. And this quote is from Dr. Beverly Tatum. This quote really grounds the work that anti-racist educators do. It gives us a visual, and let's be honest, our kids love visuals, and visuals are great devices to help us see exactly how something is done, right? So if you just take a second, close your eyes, and imagine a conveyor belt, right? One of the easiest conveyor belts to imagine yourself walking on that we often forget is a conveyor belt are those moving walkways at airports, right? So imagine that you are on that moving walkway. And that walkway is constantly pulling us in the direction of white supremacy culture. It's pulling us in a direction of the status quo. And we know that in order to reach the outcomes that we want to see happen in education, we have to disrupt that status quo. So it's not enough for us to just stop on that conveyor belt, right? Because even on those moving walkways, when we stop, we are no longer moving as quickly in the direction that the walkway is taking us, but we are still getting pulled in that direction, right? Like we aren't helping ourselves get there any quicker, but that conveyor belt is still running. So what we have to do in the visual I want you to see is we've got to turn around on that conveyor belt and a move at a speed faster than that conveyor belt, faster than the status quo, so that we are being in achieving the goals of equity and belonging that we want to see happen in education. So what's the plan? The plan today is to start with a couple of activities just to ground ourselves in what it is that anti-racist educators do. We are going to define 2 key words that are critical to this work. Those words are implicit bias and microaggressions. Then we're going to talk a bit about the what. But most importantly today, we are going to spend time talking about the 4 keys. And the 4 key levers are the how. It's how we create this space of belonging and equity for our young people within the 4 walls of our classroom. We have here, because all educators love a good learning target. So our target today is for you to be able to identify the components of an anti-racist classroom and strategies to create more equitable learning environments. And as I mentioned earlier, you'll need your workbook, but don't feel, that you have to write directly or type directly into your notebook. You can use it as a guide if that feels best for you. So I'm gonna go ahead and ask you to pause here and go ahead and make that copy of your workbook if you haven't. Set up your workspace and press play when you are ready to go. All right, first thing that we're gonna do is meet Jane Elliott. Now, some of you may be familiar with Jane Elliott and her work, some of you may not, but I'm gonna ask that you pause here and take a quick peek at this video. I believe it's less than 3 minutes. It's linked here, but it's also linked in your workbook. So don't worry about having to look for the video. It's linked, the YouTube video is linked for you in your workbook. So press pause and I'll see you back in a few minutes. All right, now we are going to get into a reflective activity. So in a second, I'm going to ask you to press pause again. And during that time, I want you to stop and jot quickly. There's space in your workbook for you to do this, or however you feel most comfortable. Stop and jot in your workbook. And I want you to think about what Jane Elliott just shared. And I want you to reflect on these 4 questions. What is your why? What are your reasons for being an educator? Why did you choose this session? And ultimately, what drives your purpose and passion as an educator? All right, go ahead and press pause and I'll see you back in a few minutes. All right, so you're back. You have done your reflection, and now it's time for the second part, or the second activity. This activity is essentially you getting to create the avatar of what you think an anti-racist educator does. So what we'll do is, in a second, I'm going to ask you to head over to the Padlet, and I want you to create and share what you think an anti-racist educator says, does, and believes. And there are columns on the Padlet where you can put what an anti-racist educator says, what they do, and what they believe, all in separate columns. And also here's a chance for you to interact with other people's and other comments that have been shared. So if you see a comment that resonates with you, go ahead and like it. And add any additional context that you feel would be helpful. All right, so press pause here and I will see you back after you complete this part of our session. All right, we're back and now we're gonna get into implicit bias. Now, a lot of times people get funny feelings, right? And that's because they get funny feelings around implicit bias because they think that it is inherently a bad thing. Now, it's not inherently a bad thing. The fact of the matter is we all have them. We all have associations, negative associations that we hold. But the difference is once we uncover those associations, those beliefs, and then what we do next. So just take a second and think about what negative associations do you hold about the young people that you serve, their families, their communities and neighborhoods. And here's a great time if you want some extra credit. Check out the implicit association test. It is a part of a study being done by Harvard and a few other organizations and universities. I forget all of the organizations and universities that are a part of the collective, but Project Implicit is offering a suite of implicit association tests that will help you uncover biases that you may or may not know that you have. So that's just a little extra credit if you have some extra time to want to dive deeper into the content in this session. All right, so we've talked about implicit bias. And now we are going to talk about microaggressions and macroaggressions. So microaggressions, and I have this video here and I'll ensure that it's linked for you as well as the video on implicit bias. I had this video here, but I wanted the thumbnail to specifically be this image because micro and macroaggressions are both a part of the same body. And when I say that, I mean that a microaggression are like the little mosquito bites, like you get one, it's annoying, we hate it, we don't want to see it. Then we keep getting them though, we keep getting them. Someone may continue to say, wow, she's well-spoken for a Black girl, right? And then someone else is saying, oh, you change your hair all the time. Then someone else says, oh, wow, you went to an Ivy League institution. And all of these things are something that a young Black girl is hearing in her day-to-day. Now they have piled up, right? But those are all considered individually microaggressions. Macroaggressions are when people who hold implicit biases and are not only making comments and omitting people of color or people who identify differently from them from the histories they teach or how they engage in the world. Macroaggressions are when those people then go commit an overt act of violence. An example of this recently would be the Buffalo massacre that happened at the end of May. And we saw that the white 18-year-old man who committed that heinous act had this manifesto where he had planned it. He wrote out how he felt about Black people. And he told and just completely wrote out his plan, right? So that would be a macroaggression. The microaggressions are things that can be written off as like, oh, they were just trying to give a compliment, or, oh, I didn't mean it in that way. But a macroaggression is an overt representation of the implicit biases and whatever ism, racism, sexism that perpetrator holds within themselves. And here I just wanted to give a couple examples, or more like 5 examples of how micro and macroaggressions can look like in the classroom. So there's not going to always be this overt act of violence, but it is just as violent to completely whitewashed history and to make your students of color or your LGBTQ plus students feel invisible in your spaces, right? To exclude certain groups and certain identities from literature, to tokenize students and families or even colleagues that have minoritized and marginalized identities, to reduce our acknowledgement of different cultures to the holidays, right? So we talk about Black History Month, but how many people even here watching knew that June was Black Music History Month? Or that even when it's Women's History Month in March, we still need to elevate and amplify the voices of women of color, of women who identify as LGBTQ plus. And also, another way that this can look in your classroom is assuming ability or family support based on social category. One thing that you may or may not have considered, and something I found through my studies when I was in grad school, was that culturally, many Latinx families in their countries of origin, if they are immigrants to the United States, or they're in their culture, their ethnic cultures, they believe that teachers hold more weight, or some believe that teachers are the holders of knowledge, right? That teachers know best. Many cultures revere the work that teachers do, right? So it's important that when we're working with a group or family, if a family is always saying yes or letting you make the decisions, that doesn't mean that they are not active or they aren't taking an active role in their child's learning. A lot of times in many cultures, it is the norm to listen to what the teacher says, because teachers carry that much respect and weight. So those are just some examples of how this can show up in your classroom in schools. And there are plenty other examples. And if you'd like to share some, you can drop them in the comments of the video, just to help people expand their thinking.
For people who still don't.
So you're probably thinking, okay, Latrice, we talked about implicit bias. We've created what we think anti-racist educators do. We have talked about micro and macroaggressions. What is an anti-racist classroom? And to answer that question, first, we're going to define what is anti-racism. So the definition for anti-racism, one that's from the NAC International Perspectives, Women in Global Solidarity. This definition of anti-racism is particularly useful for us as educators, because it tells us what we do and how to do it, right? And a lot of times, even when we're writing learning targets, right, we are saying what our young people will be able to do and how, like what's the strategy. So with that, anti-racism is the active process, so it's telling us what it is, of identifying and eliminating racism. So it tells us what it is, and it tells us how we do it. We do that, we engage in this active process by changing systems, organizations, structures, policies, practices, and attitudes. So that is the way that I hope to frame, and I hope that you can frame what anti-racist educators do, right? So we know what they do and we know how they do it. They engage in the active process of identifying, eliminating racism by changing the systems, structures, organizations, policies, attitudes of the people in their ecosystem. And in our ecosystem, that would be schools and classrooms. So you're probably saying, okay, so what does an anti-racist educator do? And if you are familiar with Ibram X. Kendi, you know he has just a plethora of work around anti-racism. And in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he specifically calls educators and anti-racist educators to actively work to dismantle the structures, policies, institutions, and systems that create barriers and perpetuate race-based inequities for people of color. So that call to action is directly aligned to the definition that we saw on the previous slide. We are actively, and remember, even on that conveyor belt, we're actively turning around, right? And moving at a speed faster than that conveyor belt to dismantle structures, policies, institutions, and systems that create and perpetuate race-based inequities and barriers for people of color. So now we're going to get into the how. How do I do this? And I'm so glad you asked, because that is the purpose we all came here for. So I'm going to give you 4 key levers of how to do this work, how to embody anti-racism in your classrooms every day. So the first thing that you got to do is address your own bias. So many times we are ready to learn a strategy, get a new tool. But in the work that I do, addressing your own bias is a strategy and a tool. Sometimes you got to sit down with yourself and take a look in the mirror and say, what are some of the beliefs I hold that may have or may perpetuate race-based barriers, right? And an example of me having to do this is even as a Black woman. When the first year I taught, I realized just how white supremacy culture doing what it does best, being the smog. And if you're familiar with Dr. Beverly Tatum's work on a larger scale than the quote I shared, that smog is in the air all around us. Even as a Black person, I had internalized a lot of the negative stereotypes that other people hold about Black people, right? I had to unlearn that. And it's hard. That's uncomfortable. I had to sit with that. It did not make me feel good. But that is the, in my opinion, most important strategy and tool that I can give you. And it's the first lever that you should pull on, and you should continue to pull on, because there is no finish line, right? Journeying to become an anti-racist educator has no finish line. Instead, it's a choice that you make every day to consciously pull on these 4 levers, right? So that's lever 1. Address your own bias. And here are some questions that you can pause and you can use to, start this reflection or even record somewhere else so that you can have these questions when you are doing that deep self-work. Second lever is to elevate student and family first. And here is where we have to get out of our own way. That student that you feel you just can't connect with, or that doesn't listen to the things you ask them to say. Sometimes, and a lot of time actually, it's rooted in we don't have the relationship with that student to where they know and their families know they can trust us, and that we are actually listening to what they have to say. some of the most challenging behaviors I've had in my classroom were remedied once I talked to the parent and simply said, what do you do when you see your child doing this thing? And then by implementing that, and that child saw there was continuity from school to home and back to school, then back home, they saw like, oh, my teacher and my family are on the same page. We're a unit. So I can't go over here acting crazy and then think that it's gonna be okay for me to go over here and not act crazy, because they're communicating with each other. And they all know how best, now they know because they have a relationship, how to listen to me, right? And also how to redirect the behaviors I'm exhibiting. So here I will ask you to pause as well and ask yourself some of the questions. And one question I really want you to think about is, am I operating as a savior? And that goes back to that power dynamic of some families and some cultures really put a lot of weight on what teachers say. And other families have had traumatic experiences in schools, like the parents themselves or prior to their child entering your classroom, to where they don't feel empowered to share their voice and their ideas and what they want to be true for their child with you. So take a step back. Am I operating as a savior? Am I operating from the viewpoint that I know best? Or am I operating as a partner and engaging the student and the families as equal partners as we work to create the best learning experience and environment for this child individually and for the whole classroom? So the third lever is to decolonize the curriculum. Sometimes that word decolonize gets a little touchy for some people, and it's because it is not a word that we have really heard used in education until more recent years. And we immediately think about colonization, like the imperialism of the Western world when we hear that word, either currently or how imperialism has looked over history. But here, what I'm saying and calling up for us is that first, in order to teach whole history, we have to make sure that we ourselves are engaging in resources and tools that tell whole history. And as we do that for ourselves as educators, we are creating space in our classroom and using resources to support that space so our students can do that as well. Two of the resources that I've used, even in elementary school, are the Zen Education Project and Rethinking Schools. And they have so many resources, including lesson plans connected to some of the popular picture books about the topics that we have traditionally not seen taught holistically in schools. So that's lever 3. First, study it, learn it for yourself, right? Don't depend on someone or one person, or even what you learned in school, to be representative of the nuanced history of our country and of the world. And finally, before lever 4, one of the ways you can create a shared space of decolonizing the curriculum is by employing Rudine Bishop Smith's Windows, Mirrors, and Sliding Glass Doors. Again, this is a video that I'll have linked in your workbook that you can watch. But a way to create like a shared community of learning whole history is to allow your students, as well as you, finding and reading books and bringing these texts into your classrooms that allow students to see into different experiences, different worlds that reflect themselves back to them, but also allow them the opportunity. And this is where your work as like the classroom teacher comes in, allow students to open those sliding glass doors and not just look through them, but open them and immerse themselves in the experiences of others. So now we have lever 4. Lever 4 is decolonize the culture. There is so much that is unsaid in schools, but it undergirds how we operate, and that's the culture, right? We may not say that LGBTQ plus students are going to receive harsher discipline than their heterosexual counterparts, right? I've definitely never even heard someone say that. But when those students show up authentically outside of what we have been conditioned to be normal, a lot of times they do get harsher discipline. Same thing for Black students. Same thing for just marginalized students with marginalized minoritized identities as a whole. And when you start talking about the intersection of those identities, so Black LGBTQ plus students, the numbers and the disproportionality in school discipline just skyrockets. And I would hope that no one is consciously making a decision to punish those children harder, those young people in a more harsh way. However, the reality is the unspoken parts of our culture allow it to happen because it's not normal. And when things are outside of our purview of normal, we tend to treat them differently. And we as classroom teachers, as educators, we have to be a part of the shift. We can't wait for the district to remove school officers. I worked at elementary schools that had school resource officers who were fully in their uniform, carried weapons. We can't wait for the district to decide to get those police officers out of our schools, right? Instead, what we can do within our classroom is when a young Black boy decides that, or not even decides, he has an embodied and outwardly, I'm trying to be very particular, like when his anger shows up as screaming, right? Instead of calling for support from the front office, perhaps having a space for him to go and calm down, and then as a teacher reflecting, okay, why might this child be screaming and acting out in this way? A lot of times it's because he doesn't feel that he's being heard, right? Or sometimes we have to really, and now we see it more often in schools, social emotional learning. But I know when I was growing up and when I was in school, we didn't talk about how to deal with our feelings. So that's just a way, a couple of ways you can think about how you can decolonize the culture in your classroom. All right, we have come to the end of our time together. So there's a couple of things that I ask of you. First, thank you for engaging in this session. But first, if you have questions, please add them to the Padlet. I'm going to check it periodically, and I'm happy to follow up with any questions that are asked there. And share some commitments. Like, what are you committing to now that you have these 4 tools in your teacher tool belt? What are you committing to? Which lever are you going to pull on first? And share those commitments on the Padlet. And you see here, like, you can press pause now, get your phone and scan the QR code or visit that link and share your questions and commitments there. And after you do that, here is another QR code for a survey. Feedback is a gift. And I would greatly appreciate if you would take some time to give me some feedback on the session. And if you are like, yes, Latrice, this is the work that I want to do. This is a place in my practice that I want to grow, join my email list. There's a link there for it. You can also join the email list by simply saying, yep, I want to join your email list on the feedback form. And if you are interested in doing this work, when you watch this video, the applications for my group coaching program, Theory to Practice, will be open. The application is going to be open from the middle of July through the first week of August. So you can go ahead and join the waitlist now. If you're watching this before the window opens, or just join my email list and you'll be the first to know when the applications open and are live. So thank you so much for spending some time with me today. If you want to continue the work, there's my link tree again. Just scan that QR code, and I look forward to welcoming you into the EdFam community. Have a great day, everyone.